Hi, I'm Bergen Eickhoff, and this is Sunday School Round 2. Today we're going to read the opening of the Gospel of John as a subversion of imperial theology. Let's begin by reading verses 1 through 5. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. This famous opening of the Gospel of John is often lifted up for its theology of incarnation, and it often isn't considered political. But by looking at the themes of hybridity in the first 18 verses of the Gospel, we're going to explore how John subverts the Roman religion to reveal the emergence of Jesus' universal empire, which draws all binaries together. So I'm really excited for this video because the Gospel of John is possibly my favorite book in the Bible, and I think it has a rich reservoir of potential for imperial critical biblical interpretation, and yet it's so rarely touched upon. But before we dive into the text, let's revisit the importance of Roman imperial theology that we first talked about way back in the Mark video. John Dominic Crossan emphasizes that Roman imperial theology was the glue that held the empire together. It was a pattern of living that ensured that citizens would operate efficiently and effectively, knowing that their salvation was tied to their call to support Rome's continued conquests. Without faith in the imperial religion, the war process falters, victory becomes questionable, and peace falls apart. So peace was conditional upon obedience to the Roman religion throughout your entire life. The stakes of Roman imperial theology are quite stark and binary. Obedience to the total truth and supremacy of Rome and its empire are required, as is the case in most imperial ideology. One way to oppose the binaries of empire is through mimicry, as we saw in Mark. Mark's portrayal of Jesus parodies Rome by demonstrating how the Savior of Israel embodies the values opposite to that of Rome. But as we explored, many critics in post-colonial theory have observed that operating under the strict binaries of empire just perpetuates an imperial ideology, and instead we see Mark just kind of recreate another empire under Jesus rather than really breaking free from imperial ideology altogether. So instead, some post-colonial theorists have seen a more worthy opponent to imperial binarism in the concept of hybridity. Coined by Indian critic Homi Bhabha, hybridity is the merging of two or more opposites together into an identity. It's what happens when cultures collide, when people, particularly the colonized, must embody an ideology of both colonizer and colonized to survive. It's the act of seeing difference as an opportunity to transform and create something new, rather than to compete or dominate. Bhabha continues to claim that hybridity subverts the power of empire by undoing their narratives of separation and superiority and rewriting them with a narrative of connection. And so today I want to analyze the opening of John's Gospel, which is often read in the language of binaries, of light versus dark and life versus death, and instead suggest that in John's introduction to Jesus, we see the author dismantle the Roman binary theology of supremacy and rewrite what religion can be by proposing a theology based on hybridity, connection, and eternity. Most crucially, whereas Rome's imperial theology requires constant obedience to a belief in supremacy in order to accomplish peace, John's theology of Jesus' hybridity is free to all who receive the life of the Word made flesh. Let's dive into the text. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Already we see some mimicry in the way that this invocation of the beginning takes the form of an invocation from an epic poem like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey or Virgil's the Aeneid. But this first verse also dismantles the ancient lineage and bestowal of divinity from Roman imperial theology. The Word has existed from the beginning, was always with God, and is also God. What? That doesn't make any sense to the imperial idea of the concentration of power. Rome claims that Caesar is divine, but not eternal. He is still separate from the other deities that originated creation, but not John's portrayal of Jesus. The Word embraces hybridity from the beginning. It is both of time and out of time, separate from God and united with God. Jesus doesn't need an ancient lineage or a bestowal of divinity because he is already deeply connected with God from the founding of creation. The following verses explain that the Word was the origin of all things and is the essence of life, which is the light of all people. The Word is not exclusive to one empire or nation. It is not concentrated in an imperial structure, but has given life and light to all people from the beginning of creation. Then we have the promise that the Word's light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. While many read this as a light versus dark binary, it's also a way of acknowledging that both light and dark live within the world. The light doesn't conquer the dark, but it is merely not overcome by it. In these opening 5 verses, we see John undoing the stakes of Roman imperial theology to explain that religion is not about power, supremacy, victory through separation, but is about recognizing that the source of life gives life to all things and draws all things together. Rome concentrates power in Caesar. John's hybrid word spreads power out through the entire world. Next, we have the recreation of the prophetic promise in verses 6 through 9, where John the Baptist emerges to testify to Jesus. But John's prophetic promise doesn't come from a foreign land. He is lifted up as the representative of all humanity, calling for divine enlightenment. And even here we see traces of hybridity in the way that God works through humanity. Jesus is emphasized as distinct from John, but is working through John to become known through John. It's confusing if you think about it, but that's kind of the point of hybridity. It confuses imperial separation systems. We should also note that the claim that the Word was the true light who brings light to all people is a response to Roman manifest destiny. Enlightenment is the job of Rome. It justified their brutal conquests. Enlightenment to the world was their reason for conquering. But if they don't actually contain the power to truly enlighten people, then perhaps their conquest and religion wasn't justified after all. And John's vision of enlightenment through Jesus doesn't come from conquest, but is already freely given to the world. The hybridity of the world is already present, enlightening the world from the beginning. And that subverts the Roman justification for obedience and violence. Mark mimicked Roman theology, but John actively undoes the theology of supremacy that holds Rome together and replaces it with a theology of hybridity that holds the universe together. But then we have the promise that Jesus, the source of all life, was in the world. The text hints at the unthinkable hybridity of the eternal Word, of light and life being manifest in human mortal form. And John shows the resistance to this idea by acknowledging that the world did not know him, and neither did his own know him. This is an illustration of both the top-down violence that Jesus will suffer from the hands of the Roman Empire that will crucify him for claiming to be God, and of the horizontal violence, the colonized, uncolonized violence that Jesus will receive from the people of Israel that reject him. The word's hybridity is not accepted in an imperial consciousness, where people are taught to seek power and peace through violence, separation, and supremacy. Yet, the word's response to this violence is not exclusion, but invitation. John writes that everyone who believes in the Word is given power to become a child of God. In Roman imperial theology, you can only be a child of the emperor through constant obedience and participation in the economy of war. Being a child of the God of Israel is given to you the second that you have received Jesus. The question is then posed, would you rather be a child of the exploitative emperor who demands a lifetime of obedience extracted through violence? Or would you rather be a child of the nonviolent Jesus who asks only for connection? JK, it's not even a choice. It's hybridity, not separation. Verse 13 explains that we are all born not of the flesh or of man, but of God. John explains that the empire cannot lay any claim on you because God created you, God created the world. The Word gives you life, and now the Word has come to be joined to what it has made. The universal empire of the Word does not operate through binaries, conquest, competition, but through creation. And then we receive the ultimate promise of hybridity. The Word became flesh and lived among us. We've already discussed how the incarnation is a subversion of Caesar's own divinity and reveals God's choice to place divinity as far away from the empire as possible. But John's incarnation is the promise of a hybrid Messiah. The Word embodies the fullness of divinity and humanity, existing for all eternity and dwelling with us in this moment. The Word does not exist separate from humanity as Caesar does from his empire. The Word and all of its life chooses to live among all of the death of human beings, not separate, but joined together. We are light and darkness. We are death and life. It is the presence of hybridity, the promise of connection through difference, that disrupts the imperial dynamic of separation and conquest. In verses 16 and 17, John writes, "In his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." It's worth mentioning that these verses have led to numerous anti-Semitic readings of John wherein Jesus' grace supersedes the law of Moses. But with the hybridity that John's incarnational invocation has established in the preceding 15 verses, we can see that Jesus is the hybrid Messiah who embodies the fullness of the law and offers the fullness of grace. Grace and law are not opposites, but are united in the revelation of the Word made flesh, who has made God known to the world. This is the promise of hybridity. It is not supremacy. It is not Jesus being better than what came before. It is Jesus fulfilling the covenantal promises of God by uniting all things together in his incarnation. And with the promise that law and grace are unified in the truth of Jesus' incarnation, we should now ask what resistance to the empire looks like in John's first chapter. Is it something to be opposed, as in Mark, because the empire has an opposite claim to truth than Jesus? Is it survival or negotiation, as in Luke and Matthew, by acknowledging that obedience to the law and reception of Jesus' grace are not in opposition? Or is it perhaps resisting empire by denying its legitimacy and relevance? For what importance is the empire when it is focused on such pathetically mortal things? John seems to suggest that the fullness of Jesus unites and connects the world better than any imperial ideology ever could. So the best way to resist the empire is by disengaging and focusing on the eternal fullness of Jesus received by faith in Jesus, who offers the unity of law and grace entirely outside of empire. To make an 80s reference, the only way to win is by not playing, and then playing a different game. I certainly don't have any of the definitive answers of how John is advocating for imperial resistance, but I think we can find some clues in the way that John uses binaries to construct a new theology of Christ's incarnation. Throughout this passage, we see the contrast between light, dark, grace, law, truth, falsehood, power, impotence, his own, not his own, even peace and violence. And on a first read, Jesus seems to embody the light side, whereas Rome, or any opposed to Jesus, is on the dark side. Well, Jesus gives life, is eternal, is peaceful, offers grace, delivers truth. Rome, or the world, takes life, is mortal, is violent, is cruel. Law is based on falsehood. And in its worst moments, Christianity has imposed the dark side of these binaries onto Jewish people, people of color, any people of non-European countries, to establish them as opposites of Jesus who need the enlightenment of, well, white people, straight people, men. But what if we read these binaries through the lens of hybridity, remembering that the authors of John would have been colonized themselves, living hybrid lives? Jesus may be presented as the light and life of all creation, but Jesus does not come to extinguish the darkness or be superior to it. Instead, the Word joins with darkness, joins with death, joins with falsehood, so that the truth of grace may be revealed to all people living under the ideology of empire. Jesus peacefully offers people their true identities as children of God, the unity of light and darkness, life and death, truth and falsehood, but endures the violence of those who refuse him without imposing his will on them. Jesus is eternal and has all the power over creation, and yet willingly enters into mortal flesh. So while the binaries of this text might make us anticipate a light versus dark division, Hybridity invites us to consider how John is destabilizing the empire by presenting a Christ who is not the empire's opposite, but draws colonizer and colonized into a truth entirely unbound from empire. Their identities as children of God, light within darkness, life within death, grace within law, the opposites united. Recall that John Crossan claims that Jesus establishes a counter-program to the Roman Empire, which moves from religion to nonviolence to justice to peace, or peace through justice, as opposed to Roman peace through victory in war. I like that idea a lot, but I wonder whether the Gospel of John would push back on the idea of Jesus as Rome's opposite as being too bound to an imperial ideology of power and competition. For when read through Homi Bhabha's approach of hybridity, we see John dismantle not only the Roman imperial theology, but imperial ideology altogether. Piece by piece, John reveals how any theology of empire relies upon binaries of separation and domination and subordination. Instead, John centers the gospel message on the Word, who draws binaries together into the eternal promise of God's parental benevolence towards humanity, which is accessed not through obedience, but through faith. John presents a form of resistance to empire that is not dependent upon competition, superiority, or opposition, but is centered in having faith in our hybrid identities as God's children who live as beings of light and darkness, truth and falsehood, life and death, peace and violence, law and grace, because we have received the revelation of God's hybridity from the Word made flesh. And when you place your faith in the hybrid ideology of God instead of the binary domination ideology of Rome, the glue of the empire begins to fall apart and the structures of oppression come toppling down. So I need to clarify that this presentation of John's Gospel is definitely against the grain, as John's use of binaries to establish Jesus' identity and purpose are often critiqued by post-colonial scholars as perpetuating an imperial ideology of power. One such critic is Mary Hui Jolly, who reads the Gospel of John from the perspective of Maori Jews. Hui Jolly claims that John's depiction of Jesus merely changes the stakes of the competition between Jesus and Rome from a political contest to a theological one, and whether John's theology is better than Rome's is a moot point, since it perpetuates the in versus out power dynamic that leads to the denigration of difference. As in Mark, the Gospel of John then just perpetuates the belief in the supreme authority of Jesus that operates through a division between who is in the light and who is in the darkness. Therefore, Hui Jolly claims that John's only success is in redefining empire as the adherence to the total authority of Jesus, rather than reforming it, and this explains why John has been used by so many colonizers to perpetuate this light versus dark, superior versus to inferior dynamic throughout history. But in contrast, Mayra Rivera argues that the hybrid nature of the Word in John's prologue inherently destabilizes the binary imagery that we see in John. Rivera observes that the logos, Greek for the Word, has been understood as the New Testament presence of Sophia, Greek for wisdom, from the book of Proverbs. Whereas Sophia in Proverbs is presented as a feminine force guiding men towards righteousness, the Logos in John is presented as a masculine force, revealing the glory and truth of God. While these might seem like opposites at first, Rivera argues that the Word is a presence of hybridity, rejecting the binaries of empire by embodying masculinity and femininity in one divine expression. The Word's purpose in John is not to perpetuate binary division, but to guide us to explore the spaces in between the binaries of imperial power, inviting us to shed an ideology of power and competition and instead receive the imminent freedom that Jesus offers us as children of a hybrid Trinitarian God whose very identity resists empire. So without a doubt, John is definitely the most complex of the Christmas stories that we've analyzed. It's weird, it's philosophical, it's poetic, and it refrains from directly addressing the reality of empire. Yet, I hope that by now we've learned that there's really no part of the Bible that doesn't deal with the reality of empire. Empire is an ideology, which means that how we practice faith is linked to our existence in empire. And even if I'm completely wrong about the Gospel of John, the Gospel would inevitably need to grapple with the reality of Roman imperial theology and Roman ideology in some way to explain why its good news is different from the empire's good news. And through the approach of hybridity, we can begin to explore whether it makes more sense to read John as a product of imperial binary ideology or as a resistance to binarism and in an alternative way of practicing religion. Determining whether John succeeds in this project or whether I'm completely off base in this is up to you. John's gospel is rich in symbolism and subtext, and it will be up to you to continue exploring the ways that John wrestles with empire. That's why it's important that we work together to challenge each other towards deeper, more critical, and more creative ways of reading these biblical attempts to communicate God's work throughout history and in our lives today. So go ahead and explore the roles of God, glory, gold, and gender in this passage and other passages of John, especially through the lens of hybridity and binaries. And let's keep aspiring to deconstruct the binaries that divide us in our lives today. Thanks for watching. See you next video.